The first thing anyone noticed was the rope. Not the men holding it. Not the guns at their hips. Not even Silas Rourke standing in the shadow of the saloon doorway with that slow, patient smile of a man who has never once been made to feel uncertain. No, the first thing that registered, the thing that stopped the breath of every person peering through dusty curtains on that breathless afternoon, was the rope. Thick and rough and knotted twice around the wrists of a 17-year-old girl who had committed no crime except the crime of speaking the truth out loud. Lila Crane stood bound to the post at the center of Ridge Hollow's Main Street, and she did not look down. That was the thing that would stay with people long after the dust settled and the stories were told and retold around kitchen tables on winter nights. Not the violence that followed, not the stranger who came from nowhere, but the fact that Lila Crane, bleeding, exhausted, humiliated in front of every soul she had ever known, kept her eyes open, kept them level, kept them aimed at some fixed point on the horizon, as if she were waiting for something the rest of Ridge Hollow had long since stopped believing in. She was waiting, it turned out. She just didn't know for what. Ridge Hollow had not always been a place where people looked away. There was a time, and the older residents could still feel it in their bones the way old injuries announce rain, when this town had a pulse. When the smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery on Sunday mornings and mixed with the wood smoke from the blacksmith's forge, and the whole street smelled like something alive and purposeful. When neighbors argued about nothing important on front porches and children played in the road until their mothers called them in, and the calling itself was a kind of music. Sheriff Caleb Warren had known that town, had loved it, in the quiet way a man loves the place where his life took its shape. He was not a large man, never had been. He was lean and deliberate, with a face that had been weathered by 14 years of service into something honest and a little sad. The face of a man who has seen enough of human nature to have no illusions left, but has chosen, consciously and daily, to keep showing up anyway. His eyes were a complicated gray, the color the sky turns when a storm is deciding what to do. His hands were steady. His voice, when he used it, carried the particular weight of a man who does not speak unless he means it. He had a son once, Thomas, 19 years old, with his father's eyes and his mother's laugh and a quality that Caleb had spent long sleepless nights trying to name and finally settled on as simply this. Thomas Warren believed that what a person did in the hard moment was the only biography that mattered. Thomas had believed that, had lived it, had walked out onto this same street 18 months ago when the Iron Crows first made their nature known, and had said something. Caleb could never hold on to the exact words anymore. They slipped away each time he reached for them like water through a cupped hand, something clear and unafraid. And the Iron Crows had shown him, and through him the entire town, exactly what the cost of clarity was. After that, Caleb Warren told himself he was being strategic, gathering evidence, waiting for the proper moment when justice could be administered through legitimate channels in a way that would hold up and stick and mean something permanent. He told himself this in the mornings over cold coffee and in the evenings when he sat alone at his desk, turning his badge over in his hands like a man trying to read a message in a language he used to know. In the honest dark before sleep, he knew better. He was afraid. Not of the Iron Crows specifically. A man who has already lost the thing he loved most past all recovery does not fear men with guns the way he once did. He was afraid of failing again. Afraid that if he moved and it went wrong, the last thing Thomas had tried to do would be answered with more loss, more silence, more proof that courage was simply a way of choosing your suffering. And so he waited, and the town, watching him wait, learned to wait too. The Iron Crows had arrived the way a slow sickness arrives, so gradually that by the time a person understood what was happening, it had already settled into everything. Silas Rourke was not a loud man. That was the first thing people said about him, and they meant it as reassurance, a reason not to worry. He smiled easily, paid his tab, shook hands with a firm, dry grip, and looked people in the eye when he spoke to them. He had the surface manners of a man raised right, and he deployed them with the precision of someone who understood exactly what surfaces were for. Beneath that surface, he was patient and absolute. The newspaper editor who printed an account of what happened to Thomas Warren found his office dark and his equipment destroyed one morning without explanation. The doctor who had spoken publicly about the injuries he treated found his home vandalized and his family threatened in terms that required no clarification. The young deputy who attempted to file a formal complaint was informed, through the discovery of his family's slaughtered livestock, that the filing would not be in anyone's interest. Nobody talked about these things in the open, but everyone knew, and knowing without speaking is its own particular poison. It spreads through a community from the inside, quiet and thorough, until what looked like a town is really just a collection of people who have each, privately, decided that survival is the only remaining ambition. Lila Crane had not made that decision. 3 days before the stranger arrived, when 2 of Rourke's men had helped themselves to her family's winter grain supply, calmly, in daylight, as if taking what belonged to others was simply a reasonable way to spend an afternoon, Lila had walked out on her porch and said, without shouting, without theatrics, in the plain, steady voice of someone stating an obvious fact, "You have no right to that." 5 words. That was all. But in Ridge Hollow, in that climate of enforced silence, 5 words spoken plainly in the direction of the Iron Crows was the equivalent of a declaration of war. They came for her the following morning, took her from her front yard while her father watched from the doorway, with the particular helplessness of a man who has already calculated the cost of resistance and found it higher than he can pay. They brought her to the center of town and tied her to the post and left her there in the afternoon heat as a message. Not to Lila specifically, but to everyone watching from behind their curtains and their cracked open doors. This is what speaking costs. Remember that. Look at this and remember that he came from the North Road. Nobody came from the North Road. It led from open flatland, from distance, from a stretch of dry emptiness that had no particular destination at either end, which was perhaps why no one saw him coming until he was already there, already at the edge of town, already moving down the main street at the unhurried walk of a man who has decided where he is going and sees no reason to rush toward it or away from it. The horse was gray. The color of ash after a fire has cooled, and the drama is over, and only the evidence remains. The rider sat easy in the saddle, not relaxed exactly, but settled, the way a man sits when he and the animal beneath him have reached a long-standing understanding about the world and their place in it. His face was not young. It was the face of a man who had traveled the full length of something difficult and arrived on the far side, carrying only what was essential. There were lines around his eyes that spoke not of age alone, but of sustained attention, of a man who had made a practice of seeing clearly and bearing what he saw without looking away. He wore no badge, carried no obvious markings of office or allegiance, just a plain dark coat trail dusted at the shoulders and a hat pulled low against the hammering afternoon light. He did not scan the rooftops, did not check doorways the way a cautious man does riding into unfamiliar territory. He rode with his eyes forward, and then, at the center of town, at the place where the road widened and the post stood and Lila Crane was bound and bleeding and still somehow upright, he stopped. He sat there for a moment that felt, to everyone watching, much longer than it was, taking in the scene with the calm thoroughness of a man who wants to be certain he understands what he is looking at before he decides what to do about it. Then he dismounted. He looped the reins around a post 20 feet away, unhurried, deliberate, as if he had all the time available to him and intended to use it wisely. Then he turned and walked forward, not fast, not slow, the walk of a man who has made a decision and is simply now in the process of carrying it out. He stopped when he was close enough that no one in that street could claim they hadn't heard him. He looked at the rope around Lila's wrists, at the dry blood along her jaw, at the men flanking her, 2 up close, 3 more lounging at the saloon front with the bored confidence of people who have never seriously had to reconsider their position. He looked at all of it, and then, in a voice that was quiet the way bedrock is quiet, solid and final and utterly without performance, he said, "Release her." 2 words. The men beside Lila looked at each other, not with fear, not yet, but with the slight recalibration of people encountering something that doesn't fit the established pattern. Silas Rourke stepped out of the saloon doorway. He took his time, let the moment develop, looked the stranger over with a measured assessment of a man pricing something at auction. "You've made a mistake, friend," Silas said pleasantly, "riding into something you don't understand." The stranger did not look at Silas. He was still looking at Lila, at the cut on her jaw, at her hands, bound and raw. "I understand it fine," he said. And Lila, who had kept her eyes open through everything, through the humiliation and the heat and the hours of standing bound in the center of a town too frightened to help her. Lila looked at him, really looked, and something moved across her face that was not quite hope, because hope had been a dangerous thing to carry for a long time now, but was pointed in that direction, was shaped like it, was perhaps hope deciding to try again. What happened next happened fast. Rourke's hand moved. Then two of his men moved simultaneously, the coordinated motion of people who have rehearsed violence into reflex. The stranger moved faster. It was not theatrical. There was no moment of cinematic pause, no exchange of meaningful glances, no dramatic declaration. There was simply motion, clean, precise, irreversible, and then there was stillness. The kind of stillness that follows something final. For men were down. One had run, bolting down the side alley between the hardware store and the feed merchant with the panicked instinct of a man who has suddenly understood the difference between the violence he inflicts and the violence that could be inflicted upon him. Silas Rourke stood with his hands raised. His face was composed with great effort into an expression of control. But his eyes had changed. Something had gone out of them. The particular light of a man who believes himself untouchable, extinguished. And at the far end of the street, Caleb Warren was already moving. He did not run. He walked. But it was a different walk than the one he had been using for 18 months. The careful, measured walk of a man perpetually postponing the moment of commitment. This walk was direct. This walk had somewhere to be. His voice, when he spoke, was the quietest it had been in 2 years. Steady in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of fear and everything to do with the decision to act in spite of it. "Silas Rourke," he said, "you are under arrest." The days that followed were not simple. They never are after something long and heavy finally breaks. There were inquiries. Federal marshals arrived from the east, filling the jailhouse with paperwork and questions and the particular bureaucratic machinery of official justice arriving after the fact. Rourke and the men who remained were taken away in irons on a gray morning while the town stood on its boardwalks and watched in a silence that was entirely different from the silence of the previous 2 years. Lila healed. The cut on her jaw left a scar, small and pale, a thin line just below her cheekbone. She did not hate it. Scars, she came to understand, are the body's way of recording the things that tried to destroy it and failed. Her father got his grain back. The newspaper editor reopened his office. The schoolhouse bell rang on a Monday morning and children ran toward it. And the sound of them running was the most beautiful thing Ridge Hollow had heard in longer than anyone cared to calculate. But Caleb Warren, on the evening after Rourke was taken away, sat alone on the jailhouse steps in the cooling dark and held his badge in both hands and thought about Thomas, about a voice that had been steady and unafraid, about words he still couldn't quite remember. He thought, my son did this first. My son stood in this street and said the thing that needed saying, and it cost him everything. And I spent 18 months telling myself I was being careful, being strategic, being smart. I was just afraid. And Thomas was afraid too, probably, and he did it anyway. The thought arrived this time without the usual wrapping of guilt. It arrived plain and clear, like a letter finally opened after a long time, sitting sealed on a shelf. And what it said, underneath the grief, underneath the loss that would never fully close, what it said was, he was yours, and you are his. And what he did was not wasted. It was the beginning of this that he was still sitting there when the stranger rode past. Ash Gray Horse, North Road, the same unhurried walk, headed back toward the open flatland, toward the distance, and the nothing in particular that he had come from. Caleb stood. I never got your name, he called. The stranger slowed. Look back once. In the fading light, his face was unreadable in the way that certain landscapes are unreadable. Too large, too worn by too many seasons to summarize. Didn't need one, he said quietly, and the dark took him. Lila asked about him later. Sitting on the steps of the general store in the first real coolness of an early autumn evening, watching the north road where it disappeared into the hills. "What kind of man does that?" she asked. "Rides in, does what needs doing, and then just leaves before anyone can even thank him." Caleb was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet before he said something he wanted to get exactly right. "The kind," he said finally, "who already knows it was right, who doesn't need the thanks to confirm it." The doing was enough for him. The knowing was enough. Lila thought about that. "Do you think he'll be okay? Out there alone?" Caleb looked up the empty road. At the last light dissolving behind the hills. At the place where a man had been and was no longer. "I think men like that are always okay," he said. "And I think they're never quite at rest either. That's the cost of what they carry." Ridge Hollow learned things in the months that came after. Not all at once. The lessons worth keeping never come all at once. But gradually, the way light returns after a long winter, incrementally, and then suddenly, until one morning a person steps outside and realizes the world is warm again and cannot identify the exact moment the change occurred. They learn that silence is not safety. That looking away does not protect the person looking away. It only transfers the cost to whoever is least able to bear it. They learn that courage is not a feeling. It is a decision made in the presence of fear, not the absence of it. Caleb Warren was afraid every morning he pinned on that badge. The stranger who came from a north road was likely afraid too, in whatever quiet way a man like that permits himself to feel it. Fear was not the variable. The decision was the variable. And they learned the most important thing, the thing that is hardest to teach and easiest to forget, that sometimes the darkness that has settled over a place for years can be broken not by an army, not by a movement, not by a perfect convergence of circumstances finally aligning in favor of justice. Sometimes it is broken by one person stepping forward. One voice, quiet and certain. Two words in the middle of a street full of silence. Release her. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the weight of Ridge Hollow's silence, or the steadiness of that stranger's voice, or the quiet grief behind Caleb Warren's badge, then you already know what Desert Heart is. We tell stories about the ones who endured, the ones who found their courage one moment too late and carried that weight with grace. The ones who rode in from nowhere and changed everything and asked for nothing in return. Drop a 1 in the comments if this story reached you. Like this video. Subscribe to Desert Heart. Turn on your notifications, because the next story is already waiting and it deserves to be heard. Ride on, friend. We'll see you next time. This story teaches that community silence enables injustice, and that one act of courage can restore what years of fear destroyed. It honors the psychology of grief through Sheriff Warren, showing that guilt and courage can coexist in a good man. It reminds every viewer that the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to look away, and that sometimes the person who saves a town asks for nothing, leaves no name, and rides back into the open world carrying only their own quiet certainty that what they did was right.